Chapter 9 of Fairylands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 9. The Starry Threshold. The only visible reminder which I have now of my residence on the island where the souls were eaten is a pocket notebook of penciled comment, with a dozen pages, blank and fair, at the back, in themselves a reminder of the fragmentary nature of that adventure in solitude, of the blank pages at the close of every chapter of experience, awaiting the final comment which is never set down. It is a small notebook of Chinese manufacture, with a pretty fantasy of flowers woven through the word memoranda, and butterflies with wings of gold and blue hovering over it, meant to suggest, perhaps, that one's memories, however happy or however seemingly enduring, are as ephemeral as they and must soon fade and die. But I am not willing to accept such a suggestion, to believe that I can ever forget even the most trivial of the events which took place at Rutiaro or at Soul Eaters' Island. By some peculiar virtue of their own, they stand out with the vividness of proportions of a childhood experience which remains fixed in the memory when other more important happenings have been long forgotten. The casual reader of the notebook would never guess this from the comment written there. Did he know the length and the nature of my residence at the atoll, he would be surprised merely that with so much leisure for observation there should be such poverty of recorded fact. I myself am surprised and a little appalled when I think how the weeks slip by, leaving me nothing to show for them. I became a spendthrift of time. I was under the delusion that my own just share of it had been immeasurably increased, that in some unaccountable way I had fallen heir to a legacy of hours and days which could never be exhausted. The delusion was of gradual growth, like the habit of reverie which fastens itself at last upon the most restless of wanderers among the atolls. In the beginning I was full of business. I remember with what earnestness of purpose I wrote on the first page of the notebook, Rutiaro, Observations on Life and Character in the Low Archipelago. I had ambitious plans. I meant to go back and forth between my hermitage and the village island, notebook in hand, saying, "Etcetera? What is that? Neva apara pomoti? How do you say that in Pomodian?" And when I had learned the language and had completed my studies of flora and fauna, I was to be the Boswell of the atolls, curious, tireless, not to be rebuked by the wind rustling the fronds or of the palms, nor by the voice of the sea, when the wind was low, saying "shh, shh," on 30 miles of coral reef. But I was rebuked, or so it seemed to me, and now I fear the learned monograph is never to be written. A faltering purpose is plainly indicated in the notebook. It becomes apparent in the first observation on the life and character of the Pomodians, which reads, "Before the starry threshold of Jove's court, my mansion is, where those immortal shapes of bright aerial spirits live enshrouded in regions mild of calm and serene air." The president of the Polynesian Society would say, and rightly, no doubt, that this is not germane to the subject, but at the time I wrote it, it was so accurately descriptive of the place where my house stood, that it might have been embodied with scarcely the exchange of a word in an exact real estate announcement of the location of my property. I set it down one evening in early summer, the evening of my first day's residence at Soul Eaters' Island. The completion of my house had been celebrated with a feast, and toward midnight I was left alone, watching the departure of the last of the villagers, who were returning in their canoes along the ocean side of the atoll. The sea was as calm as I have ever seen it, and as they went homeward, dipping their paddles into the shining tracks of the stars, My guests were singing an old chant. It was one of innumerable verses, telling of an evil earth spirit in the form of a sea-bird, which was supposed to make its home on the motu, and at the end of each verse the voices of the women rose in the refrain, which I could hear long after the canoes had passed from sight. Ai, ai, te namai, alas, alas, how beautiful it is. A lament that a spirit so vindictive, so pitiless, should be so fair to outward seeming. Standing at the starry threshold, listening to the ghostly refrain, I translated its application, its meaning, too, from the bird to the island where, perhaps, I would one day see it in my rambles. I regretted that it was so inaccessible, so remote and hidden from the world, as though that were not more than half the reason for its untarnished beauty. It is a maudlin feeling, that of sadness at the thought of loveliness hidden from appraising eyes, and I am inclined to think that it springs not so much from an unselfish desire to share it as from a vulgar longing to say to one's gregarious fellows, "See what I have found. Can you show me anything to equal it in beauty, you dwellers in cities?" Whatever its source in this case, I was glad that it passed quickly. No tears stained my pillow, even though I knew that Rutiaro could never be the goal of Sunday excursionists. But I was not quite easy in mind as I composed myself for sleep. I had made a poor beginning as a diarist. The first entry was fanciful and, furthermore, not my own. What original contribution to truth or beauty could I make as a result of the day's events? Finally I rose, lit my lamp, and wrote underneath the Comus quotation: "The Plutonians are very fond of perfume. This is probably due to the fact that their islands, being scantily provided with flowers and sweet-smelling herbs, they take this means of satisfying their craving for fragrant odors." Alas, alas, how erroneous it was, that observation! But I thought when I made it that it was based upon a careful enough consideration of the facts. During the afternoon I had distributed some gifts among my guests, chiefly among the children. I had some bolts of ribbon and dress goods, some earrings and bracelets, thinly washed in gold, which I had bought on credit of Moy Ling the Chinaman, and had been saving them for just such an occasion as the feast at Soul Eaters Island. I also had a case of perfume, which Moy had been very reluctant to part with. Perfume and toilet waters in fancy bottles, with quaint legends printed on the labels. June Rose, which the makers admitted had as much body as higher-priced perfumes. Wild Violet, like a faint breath from the forest floor. Kifa Bouquet, the soul of the exquisite Orient, etc. This gift was greatly coveted. Pinga immediately took charge of the 3 bottles I had given his daughters, and packed them carefully in a Peru, together with a bottle of bay rum presented to him by virtue of his office as village barber. Rangituki went among her grandchildren, scolding and ranting until she had made a similar collection, and in a short time all the perfume was in the hands of a few of the older people. This seemed to me rather high-handed procedure, but it was not my place to interfere with parental and grandparental authority, and it was as well, perhaps, that the children should be restrained. Otherwise they would have saturated their clothing and their hair, and the atoll would have smelled to heaven or very near it. I thought no more of the episode until the following Sunday, when I went to church at the village. A combined service of Latter-day Saints and the Reformed Church of Latter-day Saints was being held, an amicable agreement which would have scandalized the white missionaries of those rival denominations, but at Rutiaro, Saints and Reformed Saints lived together peaceably enough. Being few in number, they often joined forces for greater effect in the homilies. The meeting was held in the Reformed Church.